of the species is finally unearthed. Big promises. We'll have to see if it lives up to its promises, which I think is primarily what everybody thought when they heard that a beloved sci-fi classic from 35 years ago was getting a sequel. Will it live up to the promises? I have to confess, I was a little bit nervous because the original 1982 Blade Runner film is in my all-time top 5 movies of all time, which is as close as I can get to answering the question, what's your favorite movie ever? I can get down to 5. And let me acknowledge right up front that I know that this is not either one of these films, many of your favorite movies. Every year I have to apologize at some point during God at the Movies for subjecting people to my movie tastes. I'll probably save the apology this year for it in a couple of weeks. But I get that Blade Runner is not for everyone. Some of you hated this movie even. That's okay. It's okay. In fact, you can take some comfort in knowing that you aren't alone in that. Blade Runner 2049 was a pretty big box office bust. And that's okay too, because it's art. Art isn't supposed to make money. Do you know how many visitors there were last year at the Blanton Museum of Art on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin? I know because I called them this week and asked. 164,000. Darrell K. Royal Texas Memorial Stadium averaged 100,000 people a football game. All right. Well, they did back when we were winning. This year's more like 89,000. But still, you know, I'm not going to judge an Italian Renaissance painter by the same measuring stick I do a Longhorn fullback. And I'm not going to judge an art house film by the same standards as a summer popcorn blockbuster. And let's be honest, that's what Blade Runner is. It's a really big, expensive art house movie. I think a lot of people were expecting something a little more mainstream. But it's, you know, it's an art house film. And the same thing was true of the original as well. The original film also lost money, at least at first, before it became a cult classic later on in subsequent years. But it is a classic. It's a cult phenomenon. There are books about the making of Blade Runner. I have read one. I watched this week a documentary about the making of the 1982 movie. And you know, when they're making movies about the making of a movie, that's probably something rather significant, rather special. And in 1982, Blade Runner really was special. A lot of people don't realize how unique and groundbreaking a film it was, because every sci-fi movie since it has copied it. It's copied the look. It is dark, dirty, slightly Asian, dystopian, urban decay. And I like both films. I think they're absolutely beautiful. And some people don't like it because it's so dark. I understand that. But let me tell you a little secret about me. It's a little insight into your pastor. Let me tell you my favorite poem. My favorite poem is by Stephen Crane, who's best known for The Red Badge of Courage, but he wrote a lot of great poetry too. And it goes like this. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial. He squatted upon the ground and held in his hands his heart, and he ate of it. Friend, I said, is it good? It is bitter, he said, but I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart. There you go. So, I like my movies like I like my coffee, all right? Dark and bitter. I kind of like that kind of thing. I like art that has meaning, but meaning that makes you work for it, not just lays it lying around on the surface and spells everything out very clearly. I was talking to somebody in the foyer out here, and they saw a movie this week and said, yeah, I was thinking God at the Movies, but it was so obvious. I was like, nah, this just lays it out there too clearly. Yeah, I prefer the mystery of it, and Blade Runner has plenty of mystery and plenty of meaning. At its heart, Blade Runner, both of them, is an exploration of what does it mean to be human. What does it mean to be human? The original film revolved around Officer Rick Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, my favorite movie star of all time, and I make a distinction between actor and movie star, okay? But Deckard was a cop, not just a cop, a certain kind of cop, charged with hunting down and exterminating what they call retiring robots who match in human strength and agility, even intelligence, mastery, even and surpass their human engineers. and these were called replicants. They were so good it was impossible to tell the difference by the human eye. And they were used as slave labor initially on offshore planets, but a few of them rebelled and made their way back to Earth illegally, seeking to find their creator. And so the officers who hunted them down were called Blade Runners. All right, computers gone wild. By the way, the original Blade Runner movie was set in 2019, which means we got about 10 months before you really got to start keeping an eye on Siri and Alexa. Okay, they got to start turning on us. But the debate has been going on ever since with fans in 1982. Is Deckard, the cop, is he really human, or is he a replicant himself? And there are ambiguous clues on both sides all throughout the movie. And so people have been debating it both then and now. In fact, the director of the original film, Ridley Scott, has said all along that Deckard is a replicant, but Harrison Ford maintains equally forcefully that he is not. So it's left up to the audience to decide for themselves. It's one of the great debates among sci-fi geeks. And so Blade Runner 2049 leaves us in that same limbo. Harrison Ford reprises his role at the back end of the film, but if anything, the waters are muddied even further by the time the final credits roll, which I love. But this new movie is not really about Officer Deckard. The protagonist of this film is a Blade Runner played by Ryan Gosling, my wife's favorite movie star, who goes by the name of Kay. Kay also hunts or retires replicants, but there's a twist. This time, he is clearly one himself. A newer, more obedient model to be sure, but a robot, not human. Our story opens with Kay landing on an isolated farm and interrogating the sole inhabitant, who he suspects is also a replicant. Let's watch their initial interaction. Well, they subsequently begin to tussle, as we might have seen in the trailer there. But the key to that scene, I think, is there in the beginning when they try to identify each other. Are you a cop? Are you NK6052? You know, I'm a farmer. In other words, what is the basis of your identity? Who am I? Am I just a number that society assigns to me? Am I the job that I perform? And there are people in the movies as well as in real life who would say that that's exactly what human experience boils down to. And this really is the key question of Blade Runner. What does it mean to be human? Why are people different than robots? Or are people different than robots? And to get at that, I want to tell you a story that starts way before 2049, way before 1982 even. I want to go back to talk about some history, specifically the 17th and 18th century movement that came to be known as the Enlightenment. 300 years ago, when the achievements of Galileo and Newton and Darwin and the scientific revolution were busy knocking down all explanations of the physical universe outside of the laws that operate on purely material substances. And by the way, that's a good thing. I, for one, am happy to know about, you know, geo-orbits and revolutions of the earth rather than, you know, trying to convince myself that Apollo, the god of the sun, drives his chariot across the sky every night. The Enlightenment thinkers, though, what they were doing was responding to 150 years of religious wars. They had seen the Catholics and the Protestants, and then the Protestants and some other Protestants just tear each other apart and burn each other at the stake and have wars that tore up both England and the continent for 150 years. And they said, surely we can do better. Surely we can find some ways to talk about understanding the natural world without theology and dogma. So all that mattered was the physical, the material, that which could be observed, dissected, experimented on, and proved. And they might have reduced the human being to the same level, if not for the intervention of a Frenchman named René Descartes. Descartes, in his Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641, was exploring, like Blade Runner, what it meant to be human. Are we more than just physical parts? What separates us from animals? Or later we might say, what separates us from robots? They are physical beings after all. And for Descartes, it all boiled down to our ability to think. He says this, if I should cease from all thinking, I would utterly cease to exist. I am therefore precisely only a thing that thinks. That is a mind or soul or intellect or reason. He's talking about human consciousness. He sums it up very famously by saying, cogito ergo sum, which is, I think, therefore I am. You've heard of this. Very, very famous words, justifiably so, because Descartes cut one of the greatest deals in Western philosophy. In exchange for conceding that the world outside of the human consciousness is nothing more than material substance, and therefore the proper domain of science, Descartes managed to keep the subjective world of the human consciousness as the location of spiritual substance, what we often call the soul. Okay? It was the first great land for peace swap deal. Scientists would be allowed to reduce everything outside of the mind to simple physical laws and material substances, and we could leave the human soul into the realm of the spirit and to God. And it wasn't a bad bargain. The scientists had enough to keep them busy out exploring the outer world for a couple hundred years so that they could let the theologians worry about the soul. But all of that began to change after World War II. And you could almost pinpoint the moment in history when human consciousness again became a target of science. Ironically, it has to do with the subject of a previous God at the Movies that we've done. Does anybody remember The Imitation Game from 2014? Remember that, the story of Alan Turing and how his code-breaking machine that really helped the Allies turn the tide and win the war? Well, Turing is known as the father of the modern computer. And he first suggested that the human brain operates like one of his computers. In fact, the proof for that he offered became known as a Turing test. Basically, he said that if you had a blind judge asking questions of both a computer and a person, couldn't see either one of them just based on text replies, if the judge couldn't determine based on their answers which one was the human and which one was the computer, then you could say that the computer was exhibiting intelligent behavior. Okay? It was thinking. And remember, what did Descartes say was the essence of consciousness? I think, therefore I am. So if a machine can think, is it an am? See? Does it have a soul? Back in our movie, Officer K returns from his assignment on the farm to be debriefed by his superior. But before he left the farm, he made a discovery. In a tree there, he found buried beneath a box of bones. And so brought it back to the station, and a subsequent autopsy showed that the bones belonged to a replicant, okay, to a robot who had died, right for it, in childbirth. That's not supposed to happen. Okay, robots don't have kids. And so that would cause a whole lot of confusion for the human race. And so Kay's boss orders him to find and exterminate this child that would have been born 30 years prior. This would be killing a human now, okay, which would be new for Kay. And he expresses his concern in this subtly important scene.
Erase everything. Even China. All trace. You have anything more to say? I've never retired something that was brutal before. What's the difference? Seems wise to have soul members. You telling me no? I was aware it was in our shoes. Attaboy. Hey, you've been getting on fine without me. What's that mean? A soul.
Well, I got to tell you, there are plenty of people today that would say that you've been doing just fine without one too. There is today in scientific circles really going on a war for the soul. Forget the war for Christmas. Forget the war over Chick-fil-A. You know, before we gear up for the 200th version of the war over evolution, I have to tell you, this battle really matters. Whether or not you have a soul matters a lot. And in the field of anthropology, the study of human beings, there are basically two camps. They're divided into two battle fronts, as it were. Monism and dualism. Now, dualism, the dualistic perspective goes back to Descartes that says human beings are physical and spiritual, dual, two parts. Okay? A body you can dissect and a soul that you can't. The monistic camp says, nope, a human being is a physical, material creature, that's it. We are basically highly functioning machines. An influential cognitive philosopher named Daniel Dennett wrote a book in 1991 called Conscientiousness Explained. It's become a standard in university and anthropology texts in classes. In it, he argues that everything about you, absolutely everything, can be boiled down to the simple flipping of neurological switches. And when critics argued, well, actually, if you follow that through, that would make us zombies. He didn't blink. He said, that's exactly what we are. We are highly functional zombies. And I hope you can see how that would be problematic for a Christian. It's impossible to hold a hardline, monistic, totally materialistic position and still be any kind of Christian that the Bible would recognize. Now, at the same time, I think we need to be careful and not react in such a way that creates any more hardline, rigid science versus faith lines that paint us into a corner, the way I think the church has done over the years with the evolution debate. You know, there have been plenty of Christians over the years that have argued, well, if God didn't create the world in 7 literal 24-hour periods, then your whole faith is suspect. That is, I think, going too far. But we do have to answer this soul question. I want you to think about this question. Have you ever thought about that? Do I have a soul? How can I know? Does it even matter? Well, thankfully, postmodernism is giving us some new ways, some new possibilities of thinking about the science and the philosophy behind this in ways that I think can be very useful. There's a third way beyond monism and dualism that I think is pretty helpful and that falls within accepted lines of Orthodox Christian belief, okay? That square with the Bible, in other words. The new science is called emergent anthropology or emergentism. So you've got monism, dualism, and emergentism. Emergentism is the belief that human consciousness proceeds from, but is not limited to, the physical parts of your body. Here's a technical definition for you. Okay? The soul is an emergent set of distinctive features and capabilities constituted by, but irreducible to, the sum of the body's biological parts. Let me explain that with an example in science, because this is talking about all kinds of science, not just the soul. But emergentism would say, think about what happens when you bond two hydrogen atoms with an oxygen atom. What do you get? What do you get when you get an H2O molecule? Water, right? You've got water. Water emerges from the hydrogen and the oxygen, but you can't say water is the same thing as the hydrogen and the oxygen. It emerges from that, but it is more than the sum of its parts. Well, in the same way, the human soul is more than the sum of its parts. So your mind, okay, your consciousness, it comes from your brain, but it is more than just neurological firings like a computer program. There's a lot of mystery to this, which, as it should be, because the human brain there's nothing as complex in the universe as the human brain. The human nervous system has 100 billion neurons. Each of those has 3,000 connections, which means each and every one of you sitting here this morning has something in the neighborhood of 100 trillion synaptic switches just always firing. That's a 10 with 14 zeros after it. So there's a place for humility here. But the neuroscience field is discovering how cognitive mental properties, okay, things like morality and consciousness and self-awareness and creativity, that they are dependent upon but not fully explainable by physical brain properties. And I think that fits with the biblical understanding of human beings. Let's look real quick at the creation account in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And I'm using the King James version of it because I like how they translate the ending of it. Look at this. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Now that word there for living soul is the Hebrew word nepes. And nepes is rendered in the Greek as psyche. You've heard of a psyche before, right? Psychology. Your psyche, your consciousness, your mind. We might call it your soul. And so according to the Bible, a soul is formed when God bonds clay, okay, the dust of the earth, material matter, with breath, okay, the ruach of God, the spirit. Our soul emerges from our physical body parts, but it is not the same as our physical body parts. So God takes dirt and God takes spirit, puts them together, and you have a soul, see? And the New Testament picks up on this same understanding. The Apostle Paul very famously uses all kinds of physical body parts interchangeably when he talks about the essence of human beings. I read several articles on this. It's almost impossible to nail Paul down when he talks about these body parts. Let me show you just one example. Two different scriptures talking about the same concept. But in Romans 6:17, Paul writes this, "But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to," here's the part I want to focus on, "obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that's now claimed your allegiance." Now, obey from your heart. The word heart there that the Greek is translated from here is the Greek word cardia. Cardia means the fleshy thing in the center of your chest that is pumping blood through your body. Okay? What do we call a heart doctor? A cardiologist, right? You get hooked up to a cardiology machine. So cardia. But look at what Paul says about obedience over in Ephesians 6, verse 6. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Okay, what did he say in the Romans passage? Obey from your heart. Here he says from your heart. But now, though in English it's the same thing, but here Paul doesn't use the word cardia for heart. He uses psyche. Now remember what we said psyche is. That's your soul. And so Paul does this intermingling with all kinds of things. Sometimes he'll talk about your sarx. That's your flesh. Sometimes you'll talk about your soma. That's your body. Sometimes you'll talk about your mind, your nous. Other times you'll talk about your spirit, your pneuma. But he often means the same thing. They all point to your psyche. So I like emergentism. It takes the physical body seriously, but it allows for something beyond the physical. It allows for what Descartes and Moses and Paul would call the soul. Okay, Anthony, great. What does that matter? Well, I got to tell you, I think it matters a lot. It matters a great deal when we talk about what it means to be human. Because think about phrases like this. What do we mean when we say, he's acting very inhumane? Or she's not acting very personable? We mean ethical things when we talk like that. Okay? We mean things that you ought to do and things that you ought not to do if you're a human being. And that's at the heart of the Blade Runner films as well. In the first one, if Deckard does turn out to be a replicant instead of a human being, what are the ethical ramifications of that? Blade Runner 2049 asks the same question, but this time it's reversed. Remember, Kay, we said, was sent off to kill the human baby that had this robot mom. Well, as he hunts down clues, he strongly begins to suspect that the baby is, him. He thinks he's the baby. Well, what would it change for him if it turns out he's human all along? Again, it comes back to this basic question. Who am I? What does it mean to be human? How do we define personhood? Well, let's, for that, shift from science to theology, okay? We are in church, after all. Historically, there have been three prominent arguments for personhood. Basically, three ways to understand what it means to be created in the image of God. Okay, all theologians say we're in the image of God, but what does that mean? And I think we can use Officer K to examine each one of these. Specifically, I want to use his name, okay, or names, what people call him throughout the film. Shakespeare famously asked, what's in a name? Well, I think there is something that we can pull from these three names in Blade Runner. I want to play you a scene in which Kay returns to the police station from an assignment, and he takes what is basically his Turing test. It's a test that assures he's not going to rebel and kill his human masters, I guess. But anyway, there are two significant names that he is called during this scene, so you have to pay attention. One, Kay, we already know, but here we discover where it comes from. Okay, so look closely for that. And then the other name he is called, unfortunately, has an F-bomb attached to it. Now, my first thought was, because I always try to clean up the clips so that anybody could see them on Sunday mornings. So my first thought was try to edit out the F-bomb. But it's so close to the word that I want you to hear that it took away the impact of it. So I thought about it, I thought, well, you know, in the context of the scene, it's a negative context. It's not promoting the use of this. It's saying you shouldn't use that word. And so I decided to leave it in. So if hearing the F word in church offends you, and I understand that, but I apologize in advance. When it was all said and done, I decided it would be more respectful not to treat you like children. Okay, I think we've heard this before, and it gets to the point I want to make. So let's take a look.
Officer KT6-3.7. Let's begin. Ready? Yes, sir. Reciting baseline.
One black Optimus began to spit. A system of cells interlinked within cells interlinked within cells interlinked in one step. And dreadfully distinct against the dark, a tall white fountain played.
Cells.
Cells.
Have you ever been in an institution? Cells.
Cells.
Do they keep you in a cell? Cells.
Cells.
When you're not performing your duties, do they keep you in a little box? Cells.
Cells.
Interlinked.
Interlinked.
What's it like to hold the hand of someone you love? Interlinked.
Interlinked.
Do they teach you how to feel finger to finger? Interlinked.
Interlinked.
Do you long for how your heart interlinked? Interlinked.
Interlinked.
Do you dream about being interlinked?
Interlinked.
What's it like to hold your child in your arms? Interlinked.
Interlinked.
Do you feel that there's a part of you that's missing? Interlinked.
Interlinked.
Within cells, interlinked.
Within cells interlinked.
Why don't you say that 3 times? Within cells, interlinked.
Within cells interlinked. Within cells interlinked. Within cells interlinked.
We're done. Constant K.
Constant K. I'll come back to that in a minute. But remember, we said that we're showing this clip to talk about the three historical theological arguments for personhood. So let me open that up. The first one is called the ontological view. All right? Now, ontology just means the nature of being. Okay? This comes from the Greek philosophy Aristotle, who, by the way, had a huge influence on the Enlightenment. And he says, what determines your worth as a person is your rationality, okay? Your ability to think, in other words. To be made in the image of God, then, is to have an intellect. So you can see how Aristotle influenced Descartes, right? There's a problem with this, though. What does it say for someone with a lower intellect? Like the mentally handicapped, for example. How do you deal with personhood if you can't demonstrate a rational intellect? And at a lot of points in history, the disabled and the handicapped have been left out of society for this very reason. And then the way that you judge intellect is problematic. Aristotle, for instance, had some views on race that are repugnant by today's standards. He believed that slaves deserved to be slaves because they lacked the capacity for reason. And honestly, in the American South, when people were trying to justify African slavery in this country, people went back to some Aristotelian dynamics and pulled those things forward. So, okay, you're a person, but you're a very restricted person. You're, in our Constitution, famously 2/3 of a person, right? In the ontological view. So that brings us then to K and the F-bomb that we heard. Could you hear it in there? What was the racial slur that they used? Did you catch that? Don't say the F part, but what's the other part? Skin job. Ooh. That's a slur that humans use in Blade Runner films to denigrate replicants. And even though it's a made-up word, it still packs a punch. I don't like to say it. It just sounds, ooh, you can't say that. But to some people, even his fellow officers, that's all K's ever going to be. Just a no-good skin job. And of course, that's meant to bring to mind racial epithets that we use in our own time. So there's some inherent ability to discriminate in the ontological rational definition of personhood. See, because you're boiled down to a justa. And I thought about, I'll use my own ethnic slur, okay, to keep it safe. But so you're just an Italian, or you're just a woman, or you're just a child. Any number of things. But the ontological argument has not led to the most inclusive theology over time. And neither has a second view that we can trace to K's name. Did you catch there why they call him that? They said from the very beginning, right? Officer KD 6-3.7. So K is short for that. Later in the film, when he does meet up with Harrison Ford Deckard says, "What's your name?" And he begins to say K. That's not a name, that's a serial number. Well, he's right. His name is just the first letter of his ID number. He's nothing more than what he does. He's simply a unit of production in the system. And that brings us to the second argument for personhood, the economic view. The economic view holds that the image of God consists not in what humans are, but in what they do. And this view was tied to the great church theologian of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. So you go from Aristotle to Aquinas now in the Middle Ages, and he said that the image of God centered not on rationality, but on responsibility. He built this off of Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image." Okay, in our image. What does that mean? In our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, over the livestock, over all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move upon the ground. So the image of God is measured in one's ability to rule over nature, okay, to get stuff done, right? What makes you a person? I'm a farmer. I'm a cop. I'm a teacher. I'm a productive member of society. So that is your value. That is your personhood. But again, what about those that aren't? Again, there is an issue with bias in this view, because if productivity is the mark of personhood, what about those who can't be productive? What about, again, the severely handicapped? If you stretch this argument to its logical conclusion, they are simply not people. In fact, it was exactly this rationale of Thomas that was used to justify euthanasia of the disabled in Nazi Germany. And that hasn't gone away. Pastor Kurt took an ethics class last semester at seminary, and they read a book by a bioethics professor from Princeton University named Peter Singer. This was published in the 90s. And he argues, based on this view, that you should be able to not only abort the mentally handicapped before they're born, but even up to 6 months after they're born. Now, most of us would call that murder, okay? Blade Runner might just call it retirement, see? Because if it's a machine, right? No, it's not a person after all. You know, nobody talks about murdering their toaster. So, do you see how we're back to our opening clip? The two guys on the farm, who are you? What does it mean to be human? Are you just a label? Are you just a number? Just a job? Just a cog in the wheel of society? That's the economic view. Well, thankfully, the movie portrays another possibility for Officer K. When he shares with his love interest, Joy, who is also an artificial computer simulation, by the way, fascinating concept. He shares with her his suspicion that he may in fact be the human being after all. She immediately buys into it. And notice what that means for her.
I always told you, you're special. Go on. Not me. Hate was came. You didn't want that. Really wanted you to not.
Sure.
It's too important for Kay. Goodbye, I wouldn't think it. Joe.
A real boy needs a real name. Your mother would have named you Joe. And in fact, later when I said, Deckard said, that's not a name, that's a serial number. He says, okay, my name's Joe. Love gave him a name, see. Love gives us an identity. And that leads us to the third argument for personhood, the relational view. In the middle part of the 20th century, the great theologian, Swiss theologian, Karl Barth, we've talked about him before. I am a follower of Barth's thought. I am a Barthian. And he said that real humanity is described by two things: relationships with others and relationship with God. First, he says, the key to understanding what it means to be made in the image of God is found in Genesis 1:27, the verse after the one that Thomas used, which says this: so God created mankind in his own image. In his image, in the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Barth says this speaks to the fundamental importance of diversity and difference. It's not good for man to be alone, so you can't truly be human without the other. Specifically, in this case, the other gender. Do you understand? God's image is so vast that it can't possibly be contained in one single gender. It takes both of us to make up the image of God. There are parts of womanhood that contain an image of God and parts of manhood that contain the image of God. They're both incomplete without seeing them together. It takes both to create humanity. Now, the world and the church have distorted that. They've warped that. But I'm here to tell you that is the clear teaching of Scripture. From the very created order of humanity, it's that men and women are equally created to bear the image of God into the world. We need each other. About to get political. I will. I'm going to tell you something I like. I read about this recently. They have a law in Iceland that they put in a few years back, where they said that no publicly held company or government agency can have a board that consists of more than 60% of one gender. It's kind of brilliant. They didn't say 60% men or women. No, 60% of one gender. So if you got 60% men, you got to have 40% women. Here's why that's brilliant. Here's why Christians should go, absolutely, because when you're making a decision and you're looking for wisdom, and wisdom comes from God, you're not going to get it if you've only got one half of God's wisdom sitting there. If you only got one half of God's image sitting there. Okay? So I think that's a brilliant dynamic. Women bring something to the table of God's image, and men bring something to the table. And you put those things together. I love it. But anyway, for Bart, it's not even just about gender or marriage. But it's about relationships in general. You can be single your whole life and still get your personhood through friends. And friendship is very, very biblical. Yes, God uses the biblical metaphor of a bride and groom an awful lot to talk about his relationship with us, right? Jesus is the groom and the church is the bride. Right? Yes, that's right. We're the bride. Get it straight. But he also uses relationships, metaphors of friendship. God says to Abraham, you're my friend. He calls Abraham a friend of God. Jesus says to his disciples, I not only call you servants, I call you friends. And so the bottom line is, though, you can't be fully human on your own, outside of relationship. And listen, the relational argument for personhood, unlike the first two, this one, for instance, look, it includes the handicapped. See, I don't care how disabled a person is. Maybe they can't think rationally. Maybe they can't be productive in society, but they can have relationships. Even a person in a vegetative state can have a relationship with their caregiver. In fact, that relationship may very well give purpose to the caregiver's life, right? So here you are, an able-bodied person, but you're wondering, does my life matter? Do I have any purpose? Does it even matter if I'm here? And then you go and care for that person that can't care for themselves, and all of a sudden you realize, you know what, through your service, you realize that your life does have meaning. And so by serving that person, you are yourself receiving meaning. So through that relationship, the disabled person is actually saving the able-bodied person. So absolutely they can have relationships. No one's left out. See, everyone can be in relationship with the other. But Bart said that's only one of the markers. Remember, there's two. And there's one thing above all that illuminates what it means to be made in the image of God. The ultimate real boy has a real name, and that name is Jesus Christ. Bart says, you want to know what the invisible God looks like? Only one way to find out. You look at the invisible Jesus. Jesus is the prototypical image of what it looks like for human beings to be made in the image of God. We can't know anything about God without seeing him through Jesus. You really ought to not, some people get into the Bible, I'm going to start in Genesis and just go. That's not a good way to read the Bible, honestly. You really ought to start with the Gospels and then go to Genesis. You know why? You'll never understand the Old Testament if you don't first understand Jesus. He's the lens through which we see everything. So Jesus is so different than any God that we would make up that he shows us the nature. And when you see Jesus, one of the things you see is he did not characterize people and categorize them by their ethnicity or by their productivity. You're blind, you're lame, you're deaf. I got a place for you. You're a beggar? Nope, you're in. You're from a despised race? No, I got room for you. You're a woman? You're a mentally challenged woman? You're an immoral woman? No problem. You belong here. Oh, yeah, privileged male power broker? Hey, I got room even for you. See, all of humanity is welcome in relationship with Jesus. So what does it mean to be human? It means relationship with God and with others. So how do we wrap this up? I'm sure there's someone here thinking, okay, thanks for the metaphysics lesson, Professor, but that doesn't help me with my real problems. I came in here with real problems I got to deal with. With all respect, I think this may be the thing that you need the most. We live in a world that tells us, go do. Why? Because you're a materialistic being, and that's what you're made for, and you just got to do stuff. But I think that before you can do, you really need to know who you are. This is foundational. You know, people who take off to go find out, find themselves, they may be onto something. Who are you at your core? Are you just physical matter? Nothing but a highly functional zombie? How are you going to get out of bed in the morning if that's the case? Have you seen The Walking Dead? You ever seen that? Listen, if you came from nothing and you're going to nothing, right, which is what everyone with a strictly material worldview believes. We are accidents of nature and death is final. Well, listen, if your beginning and your ending are meaningless, why would you assume anything in your middle is going to have meaning? Right? How can we talk about right and wrong? How can we talk about what people should and should not do if we're all just highly functioning computers? Do you see the ramifications of this? Who are you at your core? You know, if you saw it, the movie leaves that answer ambiguous, really both for Deckard and Joe. There's plenty of debate about their nature. But not for you. Not for you. Listen, you can't prove you have a soul. So we said it's not something to be dissected. It is something that comes by faith. The spiritual realm is only accessed by faith. Not an unreasonable faith. By the way, I think it takes faith to believe you're nothing more than a computer, actually, as well. But if the Bible is right, then you were made by a creator, and you were made for a purpose. You were made in the image of God to live forever in relationship with Him. And if that's true, then your life has all kinds of meaning. All kinds of meaning. But listen, you've got to decide what you believe about this. You're the one that's going to have to decide what to believe. That's what it means to have faith. See, faith is not just about emotions, but it's also about how you think. If you don't get anything else from this today, I hope you get that. What you think matters. If you've heard people say, oh, Christianity is just check your mind at the door and come be brainwashed, not true Christianity, not at all. We want you to think. We want you to wrestle. Does it matter whether or not you have a soul? You know what? I think it mattered to Jesus. He said, what good would it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? It matters to God. Does it matter to you? Let me pray for you. Father God, we need your Holy Spirit now. This is a little more tricky, a little more thoughtful dynamic. We're not talking about how to be a good steward of your budget today, or even how to, I don't know, how to get your kids to obey, or some real practical thing. This is more cerebral, and yet it matters. It matters deeply. And so, Father, I think about this is if we make this decision, what are we? So we got to decide. We're going to take somebody's definition and stick it on our life. Are we going to believe what our professors told us, that we're just a lump of dirt? And that's all we are, and one day nothing but darkness awaits for us. We're just a random chance of atoms that happen to get thrown together. Well, there's ethical repercussions that come with that. Or are we going to choose to believe what this ancient text that so many people have believed and have wrestled with and have come to these fascinating conclusions over the years? And even when they look a little different, like Aquinas and Karl Barth, the similarities are so much greater. They're both pointing to this man Jesus that came into the world. And so, God, if we decide, yes, we have a soul this morning, we got to decide what we're going to do with that. What does it mean to be a human being? And there's two ways. And so, Father, I think of two kinds of people today. First of all, there are people in here that aren't living fully in relationships with others. This is one of the great crises of our day, God. We are becoming less and less human as we become more machine. We become less connected to our world. We don't even go to Blockbuster anymore and talk to people when we pick up a movie. We just boop, hit a button and it streams into our personal devices. God, we're losing our relationships. And I know even in this church, there are people struggling with this. But God, relationships take work. So maybe you're speaking to some of us this morning and saying, my child, I've created you as this human soul. You're acting like a robot. And in the end, whether you're human or not, it's not going to matter if you act like something you're not. So Father God, would you give us the courage today to make some decisions? Some of us need to invest some time into relationships. Some of us need to quit waiting for someone else to make the first move and invite some people over. Get some people together. It's going to take sacrifice. We'll have to clean some stuff up. We'll have to cook some food. We'll have to take a little risk. And God, I know we're busy, and I know we've got all these things, but Father, help us not to buy into the lie this world tells us that we're just purely functional beings. We're just economic commodities, God. We're so much more than that. So help us to get our relationships with others. But then, Father, the last one, the most important one is our relationship with you. God, I just pray if there's anybody in this room that's not yet made that decision to become a follower of Jesus Christ. It's a very simple way in. God, you say, through your Apostle Paul, that if anyone confesses with their mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in their heart that God raised him from the dead, that they will be saved. And so, Father, to become a Christian, all it means this morning, it's not a standard of perfection. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. It's simply this. It's simply saying, Father God, I admit that I've been trying to do things my own way. I have not been submitting to your definitions of what it means for me to be a human made in your image. But God, now I see that, and I see that through your Son, Jesus Christ. And I see what he did on the cross, and I choose to believe by faith that he really did come into the world. And that out of love, he went to the cross and died. But he didn't stay dead. That on that third day, he came back from the dead so that one day I will too. And I will live with you forever. But I don't just bury my head and wait for that day. No. That transforms how I live today. And I begin to work for your kingdom to come onto this earth as it will in heaven. And so, Father, if there's anybody in this room, I pray that they would pray that today. Father God, I'm in. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and I want him to become the leader of my life. And Lord, you say in that moment, there will be a party in heaven. God, I pray there'll be some parties today. Help us all, God. Help us to be rebels in our world that wants to make us machines, that wants to make us slaves, that wants to make us less than human. Help us to be the human beings, the fully alive persons in the image of God that you've created us to be. In Jesus' name we pray.